In the dense, unforgiving jungles of 17th century Brazil, a kingdom rose where no kingdom was supposed to exist. It was not marked on colonial maps, nor celebrated in European chronicles, but for tens of thousands of men, women, and children who had escaped the chains of slavery, Palmares was more than a refuge. It was freedom made flesh, a living defiance against an empire built on bondage. For nearly 100 years, this hidden nation of fugitives thrived. It had leaders, armies, and fortified villages. It had fields tilled not by slaves, but by free hands. And at its heart stood a warrior king, Zumbi dos Palmares. To his people, he was a symbol of hope and protection. To the Portuguese and Brazilian elites, he was a nightmare they could never silence. But history has a cruel way of remembering. The chronicles tell us little of Palmares. Its triumphs were buried, its people described only as rebels, its king reduced to a myth. What remains is a story whispered in fragments of betrayals and battles, of fire-consuming villages, and of a last stand against impossible odds. This is the forgotten history of Palmares. This is the rise and fall of freedom in the shadow of slavery. And this is the story of Zumbi's final stand. The jungles of Brazil in the early 1600s were not silent. Behind the songs of birds and the roar of rivers, another sound carried through the trees, the footsteps of those running from chains, men, women, and children, skins scarred by whips, lungs burning from sugar fields, vanished into the night and sought the only refuge left, the mountains. Brazil was the beating heart of the sugar empire. Portuguese masters carved wealth out of the land with endless cane fields, watered not by rain, but by sweat and blood. Africans were brought by the tens of thousands, ripped from homelands, branded like cattle, and forced to work until death. For most, escape was impossible. For some, it became destiny. Those who fled carved paths into the thick jungle. They built huts out of mud and palm leaves, planted cassava and maize, and learned to live as ghosts beyond colonial reach. At first, these were small clusters, families hiding in caves, fugitives moving in silence. But as time passed, the settlements grew. Whispers spread across plantations. There was a place in the wilderness where no master ruled, a place where whips could not reach, a place called Palmares. Palmares was not a camp of fugitives, it was a kingdom. Hidden deep in the Serra da Barriga Mountains, it spread across valleys and forests, a network of fortified villages known as macambos. Each settlement was bound together by trade, kinship, and the dream of freedom. Fields stretched across cleared land tilled by free hands. Cassava, corn, beans, and sugarcane were planted, not for export, but for survival. Hunters tracked game, women gathered fruits, and children carried water from streams. Life was harsh, but it was life chosen, not imposed. Palmares was more than survival. It was culture reborn. Drums echoed through the night carrying rhythms of West Africa. Rituals honored ancestors. Oral traditions kept the memory of stolen homelands alive. In these mountains, Africans became more than slaves in exile. They became a people, shaping a new identity of resistance. Leaders were chosen, not by birth, but by strength and wisdom. Councils decided disputes, warriors guarded the borders, and scouts watched the paths that snaked through the jungle. Any stranger approaching Palmares was spotted long before arrival. To outsiders, Palmares was a ghost nation, invisible and untouchable. But to the enslaved across Brazil, it was a beacon. On the plantations, whispers spread like fire. Somewhere in the mountains, freedom was real. And with each whisper, another chain broke. Another runaway risked death to find the kingdom that lived beyond maps. The Portuguese could not ignore Palmares forever. At first, they dismissed it as a nest of fugitives, a temporary shelter that would collapse under hunger and fear. But Palmares did not collapse, it grew. Runaways from distant plantations risked weeks of travel through swamps and forests, guided only by memory and rumor until they reached the hidden villages. Traders, too, made contact, some willing to exchange weapons, iron, or salt in secret. Palmares was no longer a shadow. It was becoming a threat. Planters in Pernambuco and Alagoas demanded action. How could they keep slaves obedient when whispers of freedom echoed louder than the crack of the whip? If Palmares thrived, rebellion would follow. To protect the sugar empire, Palmares had to burn. The first expeditions into the mountains were small. Bands of armed men, sometimes led by Indian allies, crept into the jungle, hoping to catch fugitives off guard. But they found more than scattered huts. They found stockades, warriors with bows and spears, women and men who fought as if death was nothing compared to chains. The Portuguese came with muskets. Palmares met them with ambush. Arrows hissed from trees, traps snapped shut, and warriors melted into the forest only to strike again. For men trained on open battlefields, the jungle was an enemy they could not tame. Defeat humiliated them. Reports spoke of villages too well organized, warriors too disciplined, and a network too vast to destroy. Some soldiers returned with nothing but wounds and shame. Others never returned at all. As years passed, Palmares became a fortress kingdom. It withstood raid after raid, each failure fueling its legend. For every house burned, 2 were rebuilt. For every warrior killed, another fugitive arrived to take his place. The Portuguese called them rebels, outlaws, savages. But on the plantations, slaves whispered a different word: heroes. Palmares was proof that the master's chains were not eternal. And among the warriors of Palmares, one child was growing who would turn legend into fire, a boy who would one day be called Zumbi. Zumbi's story begins in fire. Born in Palmares around 1655, he came into a world already at war, a kingdom forged in resistance, surrounded by enemies who never ceased hunting. From the moment of his birth, he was marked by both danger and destiny. As a child, he was captured during a Portuguese raid. Torn from his family, he was taken down from the mountains and handed to a missionary. Baptized with the name Francisco, he was raised in a church where Latin prayers replaced the songs of his ancestors. The Portuguese believed they had tamed him. But inside Zumbi, the fire of Palmares never died. He learned to read, he learned the rituals of the church, but he also learned to wait. Every prayer he whispered in Portuguese was shadowed by another prayer, silent and older, carried from Africa. At 15, he escaped. Slipping through the night, he vanished into the forests, retracing the hidden paths he had once been stolen from. When he returned to Palmares, he was no longer a boy. He was a survivor of 2 worlds, trained in the ways of the Portuguese, yet rooted in the freedom of the mountains. His courage set him apart. He hunted with tireless skill, fought with a strength beyond his years, and commanded respect with his words. Warriors followed him not because he demanded it, but because his presence made fear itself seem smaller. By his 20s, Zumbi had risen to command warriors in battle. He struck the Portuguese with precision, leading ambushes that turned raids into disasters. His knowledge of European tactics made him dangerous. His unbreakable spirit made him unstoppable. Yet, he was not only a fighter. Zumbi became a symbol. To the people of Palmares, he embodied freedom itself. A man who had walked in the world of the master, returned from it, and chosen defiance. His name carried through the Macambos like a spell, whispered by mothers to their children as a promise. Zumbi will protect us. But his rise brought tension. Palmares already had a leader, Ganga Zumba, who favored negotiation with the Portuguese. Zumbi, younger and fiercer, distrusted the enemy and warned that treaties were nothing but traps. His defiance created cracks in the unity of Palmares. The people stood at a crossroads, a path of peace with the slavers or a path of endless war. And in the heart of this struggle, Zumbi sharpened his resolve. He would never bow, never sign a paper that chained his people. Freedom, he believed, could only be defended by the sword. The Portuguese would soon discover that Palmares had found not just a warrior, but a king who would fight to his last breath. By the late 1600s, Palmares had grown into a nation. No longer a scattering of fugitives, it sprawled across the mountains in a vast network of villages. At its heart stood Macaco, the main settlement, with houses of clay and wood, fields of maize and cassava, and drums that beat long into the night. Historians estimate that up to 30,000 people lived within Palmares at its height. Entire families raised children who had never known the crack of the whip. Generations were born free, growing tall and strong beneath the canopy of the forest. For them, Palmares was not a refuge, it was home. The structure was remarkable. Councils resolved disputes, warriors guarded perimeters, and leaders managed resources. There were smiths forging weapons, healers preparing medicines, and farmers sustaining the community. Life was precarious, but it was organized, a mirror of African kingdoms transplanted into Brazil's wild heart. Palmares was also a mosaic of cultures. Runaways from Angola, Congo, Yoruba, and Ashanti mingled with indigenous allies who had their own reasons to resist Portuguese conquest. Languages intertwined, religions fused, and from this mixture, a new identity emerged, the people of Palmares. Trade flourished in secrecy. Some free settlers nearby, sympathetic or greedy, exchanged iron, salt, and even firearms for food and goods. Portuguese merchants cursed Palmares as parasites, but could not resist the hidden markets that linked them. The kingdom was not isolated, it was connected. But what made Palmares legendary was its army. Warriors trained with bows, spears, and stolen muskets. They patrolled the forests, striking fear into slave hunters who dared approach. Every raid was answered with retaliation. Every capture fueled a rescue. To masters in Pernambuco, Palmares was a nightmare without end. Zumbi had now become more than a commander. He was the face of resistance. In the villages, his presence stirred pride. On the plantations, his name spread like wildfire, whispered by those plotting escape. He was proof that the enslaved could fight back, that freedom was not a dream but a place, guarded by men like him. Songs were sung in his honor. Mothers taught their children to walk with courage, reminding them that Zumbi stood watch in the mountains. For those still in bondage, Palmares was the North Star, a direction, a hope, a heartbeat calling them home. The Portuguese grew desperate. Palmares was not just harboring fugitives, it was undermining the entire system of slavery. If one kingdom could survive, why not two? Why not 10? The dream of empire was cracking, and at its center stood a people who refused to kneel. For nearly a century, Palmares endured. It was a miracle of resistance, an impossible kingdom that mocked colonial power. But history is merciless. Empires do not forgive. And as Palmares reached its golden age, the shadows of betrayal and destruction were already gathering at its borders. No kingdom stands forever without cracks. Palmares had survived nearly a century, but the pressure of war and the weight of survival slowly bent even the strongest walls. Inside the jungle fortress, unity began to splinter. At the head of Palmares stood Ganga Zumba, Zumbi's predecessor and kin. Ganga Zumba favored peace. After decades of endless raids, he believed negotiation might spare his people. Portuguese officials dangled promises, freedom for those in Palmares if they would submit, move to controlled villages, and return all new runaways. To Ganga Zumba, it was a bitter compromise, but a possible lifeline. To Zumbi, it was betrayal. How could freedom exist if it required bending to the same empire that had enslaved them? How could a treaty be trusted when written in the blood of their ancestors? The council was divided. Some were exhausted by war. Mothers feared for their children. Farmers longed for peace. Others, the warriors hardened by battle, stood behind Zumbi. They knew the Portuguese never honored their word. Every treaty was a trap, every promise a chain in disguise. The debate split Palmares. Ganga Zumba signed the treaty. Several villages agreed to move under Portuguese supervision, but Zumbi refused. He denounced the pact, called it a death sentence, and rallied those who would never bow. His defiance turned him from commander into leader, from warrior into king. The Portuguese smiled. Division was their greatest weapon. With Palmares fractured, their chance had come. Spies were sent, alliances were offered, and betrayals were bought. Men who once fought beside Zumbi were tempted with promises of safety or gold. Still, Zumbi resisted. His villages trained harder, their defenses tightened, and their raids grew fiercer. But every battle cost lives. Every skirmish drained strength. For each victory, there was a price, a burnt field, a fallen comrade, a hungry child. Inside Palmares, fear began to whisper. Could Zumbi truly protect them forever? Was his path of endless war leading them to survival or to ruin? Those questions spread like smoke, invisible but suffocating. And beyond the forest, the Portuguese prepared for war like never before. This would not be a raid or a punishment. This would be annihilation. They called for armies of thousands, armed with muskets, cannons, and the full weight of colonial fury. Palmares had endured ambushes and raids. It had endured betrayal and division. But now it faced something different, the determination of an empire to erase it from existence. The stage was set for the last and bloodiest chapter. The jungle would burn. The walls of Macaco would shake under cannon fire, and Zumbi, the king of freedom, would be forced to choose between life, legend, and the sacrifice that history never forgot. The mountains of Serra da Barriga had seen fire before, but never like this. In 1694, the Portuguese gathered the largest force ever sent against Palmares. Soldiers marched with muskets and pikes, cannons dragged across rugged paths, banners snapping in the wind. They were not coming to punish, they were coming to erase. The army numbered in the thousands, hardened veterans from colonial wars, slave hunters eager for reward, and mercenaries promised land and gold. At their head rode Domingos Jorge Velho, a bandeirante known for ruthlessness, his reputation built on hunting indigenous people and crushing any who defied Portugal. To him, Palmares was not a community, it was prey. Scouts from Palmares saw the army days before it arrived. They ran through the forest to warn Macaco, the central stronghold. The warning spread like wildfire. The empire is coming. Mothers clutched their children, warriors sharpened spears and cleaned muskets. Farmers buried food, preparing for a siege that might last weeks. The first cannon blast shattered the silence of the mountains. Boulders of iron slammed into palisade walls, tearing wood apart. Smoke filled the air as soldiers advanced in formation, shields raised. But the warriors of Palmares met them with arrows, muskets, and ambush. From the trees came volleys of fire. From the gates came counterattacks, fierce and desperate. The Portuguese were stunned by the resistance. Dozens fell in the first assault, but they had numbers, discipline, and endless ammunition. They regrouped, reloaded, and pressed forward again. The battle became a storm of gunfire and screams. Inside Macaco, the people endured. Women carried water to the front lines. Elders prayed as drums beat the rhythms of defiance. Children huddled in shelters while the walls shook with cannon blasts. Every heartbeat felt like the last. Days turned to weeks. The Portuguese cut off supplies, burning fields, poisoning streams, blocking every path. Hunger gnawed at Palmares. Warriors fought with empty stomachs, their bodies weakened but their spirit unbroken. Zumbi rode among them, never hiding, always visible. His presence was fire. He lifted fallen comrades, rallied defenders, and struck back with raids that harassed the enemy camps at night. To his people, he seemed unkillable. To his enemies, he was a shadow that refused to fall. But even shadows can be broken. After weeks of siege, the walls of Macaco collapsed under relentless cannon fire. Portuguese troops surged inside. The fighting turned house to house, alley to alley. Women fought with knives, old men with clubs, children with stones. Palmares was not conquered. It was bled dry, every corner resisting until no strength remained. Smoke choked the sky. Flames consumed homes built with generations of labor. Screams echoed across the valley as soldiers dragged captives away. The free nation of Palmares, after almost 100 years, was falling into ashes. Yet, even in defeat, the people refused to give the Portuguese what they wanted most: submission. Many chose death rather than capture, hurling themselves from cliffs, vanishing into fire, denying their enemies the satisfaction of chains. And in the heart of the ruins, Zumbi still fought. Bloodied, weary, yet unbroken, he stood against the tide of empire. His last stand had begun. The fall of Macaco was not the end of Zumbi. Through smoke and chaos, he escaped with a band of loyal warriors, slipping into the forests that had protected Palmares for generations. Wounded but alive, he refused to surrender. For months, he led a ghost war against the Portuguese, striking camps, freeing captives, and vanishing into shadows. To the colonists, Zumbi became a specter. They believed they had destroyed Palmares, yet resistance still flickered wherever he walked. His survival was an insult, a wound that would not close. To the enslaved across Brazil, his defiance was legend. If Zumbi lived, freedom still breathed. But empires have long memories. Bounties were placed on his head. Scouts, spies, and traitors were promised rewards greater than dreams. Slowly, the noose tightened. Trust became fragile. Every companion was a potential betrayer. The betrayal came from within. One of his own men, captured and tortured, revealed Zumbi's hiding place. At dawn, Portuguese forces closed in on the camp where he slept. Outnumbered and surrounded, Zumbi and his warriors fought with fury. Muskets roared, blades clashed, blood painted the ground. One by one, his defenders fell. Zumbi was captured alive. His body was broken, but his eyes still burned. Dragged in chains, he faced the soldiers who had hunted him for years. They demanded submission. He gave them silence. They demanded confession. He gave them defiance. On November 20th, 1695, the executioner's blade struck. Zumbi's head was severed, his body displayed in the capital of Pernambuco as a warning. His severed head, placed on a pike, was shown to the crowds, proof, the Portuguese claimed, that the myth of Palmares was dead. But myths do not die with bodies. In villages, on plantations, and in whispered prayers, Zumbi's name grew larger. He had been flesh. Now he was fire. He had been king. Now he was memory. And memory cannot be chained. The Portuguese believed they had silenced him. Instead, they had created a martyr. Zumbi's death was meant to kill hope, but it became a spark carried through centuries, lighting the struggle of every enslaved soul who still dreamed of freedom. The last stand of Zumbi was not only the end of Palmares, it was the birth of a legend that empires could not erase. After the fires of 1694, the Portuguese declared victory. Palmares was gone, its villages turned to ash, its warriors dead or enslaved, its king executed. They believed the memory would fade, swallowed by silence, erased by fear. For a time, it seemed to work. Colonial records reduced Palmares to a footnote, a rebellion of runaways crushed by the empire. Zumbi's name was blackened, twisted into legend without context, a ghost invoked more by rumor than history. The victors wrote their version of the truth, and for centuries, that version stood unchallenged. But memory has its own weapons. In hidden songs, in whispered prayers, in stories carried by the enslaved, Palmares survived. It lived in fragments, tales of a jungle kingdom, of warriors who never bent the knee, of a king whose fire could not be extinguished. Generations passed, Brazil grew, slavery expanded, and Palmares became myth. Yet, myth is dangerous. On plantations, whispers of Palmares reminded the enslaved that freedom had once been real. Rebellions drew strength from that memory, from the knowledge that an entire nation of fugitives had stood against the empire for almost a century. In the 19th century, abolitionists began to rediscover Zumbi. His story became a banner, a symbol of resistance not only against slavery, but against forgetting itself. The empire had tried to erase him, but scholars and revolutionaries raised his name again. By the 20th century, Afro-Brazilian movements embraced Zumbi as a hero. His defiance inspired writers, musicians, and activists. Palmares was no longer just history, it was identity. November 20th, the day of his death, became celebrated as Black Consciousness Day in Brazil, honoring both Zumbi and the long struggle of his people. Today, the ruins of Palmares are a national heritage site. Pilgrims climb the Serra da Barriga to stand where Macaco once stood, to feel the ground where freedom was defended against impossible odds. Statues of Zumbi rise across Brazil, his name invoked in marches and songs. What was once erased has been reclaimed. Palmares is no longer a whisper in the shadows, but a reminder carved into stone and memory. Freedom was always possible, even in the darkest age. And Zumbi, the man once paraded in death to prove his defeat, now stands immortal, a king who still walks in the heartbeat of his people. History remembers kings crowned in gold and generals who carved empires in blood. But the story of Palmares reminds us that the truest crowns are forged in defiance, and the strongest empires can rise from fugitives who refuse to kneel. For nearly a century, Palmares stood as living proof that freedom was possible. It was not fantasy, not legend, but reality. A kingdom built by the enslaved, defended by the forgotten, sustained by the will to live free. The Portuguese destroyed its walls, they burned its fields, scattered its people, and paraded its king in death. Yet what they could not destroy was the idea at Palmares' heart, that no chain is unbreakable, no empire eternal. Zumbi's last stand was not just the fall of a kingdom, it was a message carved in fire: resistance endures beyond death. His silence at execution became louder than the muskets that killed him. His severed head, displayed as warning, became a beacon for generations. This is why we tell forgotten history. Because buried beneath the ruins, behind the lies of conquerors, there are voices still calling to be heard. Voices of men, women, and children who refuse to vanish. Voices that demand we remember. Palmares was destroyed, but it was never erased. Zumbi was killed, but he was never silenced. And today, their legacy speaks to us still. Freedom may fall, but it always rises again. This was the story of Palmares. This was the last stand of Zumbi. And this is Forgotten History.